The G20 Leaders Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, closed this weekend under circumstances unlike any the group has faced in its 26-year history. This was the first time a G20 summit was held on the African continent, a moment South Africa had long prepared for and hoped would spotlight the priorities of developing economies. But the event became equally defined by the unprecedented absence of the United States, whose government, under President Donald Trump, boycotted the gathering. The boycott came after Trump accused the South African government of confiscating land from white farmers and allowing a tax on white Afrikaners, claims widely rejected by South African officials, researchers, and international observers. In addition, Washington objected to what it saw as excessive emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion within the summit's agenda. Against this backdrop of tension, the summit opened with a sense of both expectation and uncertainty, testing South Africa's ability to guide a major multilateral forum amid a deep diplomatic rift. One of the most unusual features of this year's summit was procedural. Traditionally, the G20 issues a joint declaration at the end of the meetings, summarizing the consensus reached. But South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced at the very start that member nations had already agreed on a final communiqué, an outcome that surprised many analysts and underscored how much preparation had taken place behind the scenes. Equally striking was the absence of the ceremonial handover of the G20 presidency. Each year, the current chair symbolically passes a gavel to the leader of the next host nation. But with Trump absent, the US asked that Ramaphosa hand the gavel to a junior American embassy official instead. South Africa refused, calling the request a breach of protocol. Ramaphosa's spokesperson said no G20 chair had ever handed over authority to a non-head of state representative and that this summit would not set that precedent. The result was a rare moment where the handover did not happen on stage, though officials said it would take place quietly the following day between diplomats of equivalent rank. Despite the political tension, South Africa presented the summit as a resounding success. In his closing remarks, Ramaphosa struck an optimistic tone, declaring that global leaders had managed to find common ground at a time when multilateral cooperation is under strain. Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola echoed this sentiment, telling reporters that South Africa had not allowed external pressure to shape its leadership role. On the other side, however, the United States expressed frustration. White House spokesperson Anna Kelly accused South Africa of refusing to ensure a smooth transition of the G20 presidency and claimed the early issuance of the joint declaration, despite US objections, undermined the group's founding principles. Trump, who plans to host next year's summit at the Trump National Doral Resort in Miami, said he intended to restore legitimacy to the G20 and shift its priorities. Even so, leaders such as France's Emmanuel Macron offered public praise for South Africa's stewardship, though he also acknowledged the divisions that had marked discussions. The joint declaration itself reflected many of the themes South Africa had hoped to elevate. It included references to climate change, the urgency of gender equality, and the worsening debt burdens faced by developing economies, issues that resonate strongly with the African Union and the broader global South-South. These themes had become points of contention with Washington, which had cautioned South Africa against issuing such a document. Nonetheless, consensus among other members allowed the declaration to stand. Argentina, whose libertarian president Javier Milei closely aligns with Trump, did not attend in solidarity, but sent representation. Argentine diplomats expressed reservations about some language in the communiqué, particularly references to climate and global conflicts, but they eventually allowed the statement to be released. For many observers, the document symbolized the growing influence of emerging economies within global governance institutions. Yet the summit's agenda was not limited to development and climate issues. Ongoing conflicts around the world played a major role in side discussions. European leaders raised concerns about the US's new peace plan for Ukraine, warning that parts of the proposal could tilt in Moscow's favor. Some argued that suggested restrictions on Ukraine's defense capabilities would leave the country exposed to future aggression. Meanwhile, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva voiced unease over the US military buildup near Venezuela, a long-standing point of geopolitical friction in South America. These disputes illustrated how the summit, even without the presence of US leadership, remained entangled in broader geopolitical tensions involving major world powers. Other absences also shaped the summit's atmosphere. Russia's Vladimir Putin, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court, of which South Africa is a signatory, did not attend. China's Xi Jinping was also absent, continuing his 2025 pattern of delegating major international engagements to Premier Li Qiang. Mexico's recently elected president, Claudia Sheinbaum, similarly did not appear, sending senior officials in her place. While such absences are not unprecedented, the combination of so many top-tier leaders missing created an environment in which middle powers, South Africa, Brazil, France, India, and others, carried much of the diplomatic weight. For Ramaphosa, this became an opportunity to highlight the role Africa can play in global governance, especially following the African Union's admission into the G20 as a permanent member in 2023. South Africa's central message throughout the summit was the need to put the Global South at the heart of the agenda. Ramaphosa argued that the world's largest economies must treat development challenges as collective concerns rather than issues isolated to poorer regions. He emphasized the structural constraints facing low-income nations, limited access to financing, uneven trade relationships, climate vulnerability, and the disproportionate impact of global economic fluctuations. Supporters of South Africa's position praised the summit for centering these issues more prominently than in previous years. Critics, however, argued that the absence of the US overshadowed the very goals South Africa sought to advance, creating a narrative more focused on diplomatic conflict than development cooperation. Even after the gavel strike symbolically closed the summit, questions lingered about the future of the G20. Washington's decision to boycott raised concerns about whether the forum could continue to function effectively amid growing geopolitical polarization. Some analysts suggested that the split reflects a larger recalibration of global power, with emerging economies asserting greater influence and traditional Western powers pushing back against agendas they perceive as shifting too far from their interests. Others warned that if the G20 becomes defined by walkouts and boycotts, its ability to address urgent global issues, climate change, debt restructuring, energy instability, and geopolitical conflict could diminish. For South Africa, however, the summit represented a moment to define its role on the global stage, challenge pressure from major powers, and assert that Africa deserves a central seat at the table. As officials prepare for next year's summit in Florida, the path forward remains uncertain. The delayed ceremonial handover, diplomatic friction over the joint declaration, and competing visions for the future of global governance all create unresolved tensions. But the Johannesburg summit also demonstrated that consensus among major economies is still possible even in the absence of the United States. Whether this marks a new era of multipolar cooperation or simply a temporary divergence is yet to be seen. What is clear is that South Africa's G20 presidency unfolded in a complex constellation of global challenges, development struggles, climate concerns, geopolitical rivalries, and ideological disagreements. And in navigating these competing pressures, South Africa closed its historic summit with a message of resilience, asserting that even amid fracture, global dialogue remains both necessary and achievable.